It's time to take a ride on the Steelers Afternoon Drive with our co-hosts, Saunders and Zachary Smith.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Steelers Afternoon Drive. I'm Zachary Smith. That is Alan Saunders. I promised you guys he'd have a different backdrop this weekend. Alan at the NFL owners meetings down in Florida. What's going on?
With the beautiful JW Marriott in Grand Lakes, Florida, near Orlando. And, talking ball, man. We talked to Omar today, talked to Mike Tomlin twice, and talked to a lot of other people. Got some rule changes through. We've got some signings that we broke. We've got all kinds of news. I feel like there's just so much that has happened since the last time we talked on Friday. I'm like,
yeah,
I feel I'm a very Ricky Bobby-ish. I don't know where to go with this show. I don't know what to do. There's all the things to discuss.
You were part of the group that got to talk to Mike Tomlin twice. You mentioned that obviously had a little bit more limited availability yesterday, right before speaking today to pretty much anybody. So, we're going to go over a lot of stuff that was talked there. Alan, I'm going to kind of let you guide the ship here because, like you said, there was so much that was talked about over the last couple days with Mike, with Omar, a few transactions. Where do you want to start with this? Because with the amount of things that were talked about, I feel like I don't even know if we're going to get through everything in this. A lot of it was like, again, stuff that we already knew about. We were just trying to get in confirmation. For example, I said, I'll let you guide the ship, but hold on. Let me bring up one thing and then we can go from here. The Kenny Pickett timeline was something that we had kind of speculated on, and you had actually brought up, you thought it went this way, and Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan pretty much confirmed that that was the way that it went.
So let's go. Let's just get quarterback out of the way, right? Let's just start there,
okay.
And then we'll see how far we go. Okay?
That makes sense.
That sounds like a good place. Probably should have figured that out, that's like the way to do this.
No, this is letting the people behind the fourth wall. This is how this is done.
That's true. That's true. Speaking of behind the fourth wall, you may see, Jerry Jones walk through the panel behind me here at some point. It's been happening all day long. Brooke Pryor of ESPN is on live 4 feet that way. So we're doing great here. The Steelers knew they were going to sign or add a quarterback. I asked both Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan this question because I really wanted to know why they had made the decision that it seemed like they were really prioritizing adding a veteran quarterback, a guy who, with experience. They looked at Russell Wilson. They obviously looked at Justin Fields. They ended up with both of them. But it didn't seem like they were that interested in the quarterbacks in the draft. Didn't really get a straight answer out of either of them. But what we did get a straight answer on was that the intention was for Russell Wilson and Kenny Pickett to compete. Kenny expressed his desire for, as Mike Tomlin called it, a change of scenery. They started to talk to the Chicago Bears again at that point about Justin Fields, liked the price, thought that they could make something work there, and that's when they traded Pickett to Philadelphia. So we got the time frame down. We got some other things down too. Mike Tomlin did acknowledge that he said that Russell Wilson is currently the starting quarterback. He used the term, pole position. He's starting out in the lead. And I think it's interesting that he sort of said, yes, I said that. And then I'm going to say that part of the discussion around the Kenny Pickett trade request, at least nationally, I don't know so much in Pittsburgh, was about the Steelers, saying that that Russell Wilson was going to start ahead of Kenny Pickett when they went to the first rep at OTAs, and that is one of the reasons why Kenny Pickett wanted to be traded. I don't really buy that. It doesn't make sense to me. He's now certainly not going to be starting in OTAs in Philadelphia or anywhere else. So I really thought that was always kind of a red herring. But it was interesting to me that Tomlin was basically yes, this is what I did, and here's why. And basically what he said was the starting quarterback of your NFL team has a lot of responsibilities this time of year, and it hurts you to not have someone in that role. And it doesn't matter if the person that's in that role now is in that role later. That when they do things like when the quarterbacks and the receivers get together in the offseason, that's the starting quarterback's responsibility. When they go out for OTAs, somebody's got to be with the first team and somebody's got to be with the second team. And in OTAs, it is not about competition. It is not about evaluation. It is simply learning your teammates, learning the offense, learning the plays, learning the system, learning your job, and learning new techniques and things that the coaching staff wants you to be working on. Mike Tomlin talks to us in that time period. He always tells us, hey, this is not football. This is football-like. This is not something we're evaluating people on. And so basically the options are, well, okay, if we're not going to separate these two guys until we let them actually compete, then that means you're not naming a starting quarterback until August. And so then, well, what are the downsides of that? Well, then there's no one that is sort of the leader of the group between now and then. And he thinks it's better to have that than to not have that. To say, hey, Russ is our guy for now, and we'll see what happens. And that's a better way to go about it than just not have a starting quarterback at this time of the year. And so I thought that was interesting. It was an interesting sort of defense of the position that he took there. And I think it probably just sort of fully explains everything that, the sort of locker room stuff that you and I had talked about with Kenny Pickett. In addition to that, was certainly the reason that he was looking for a move elsewhere. And then they went and signed Kyle Allen after we talked to Mike right before we talked to Omar. Actually, Omar broke the news to us. And it sure seems like 1, 2, 3. They're now set at quarterback. I know we talked a lot about day 3 options in the draft, guys like Spencer Rattler, Jordan Travis. I don't know. Doesn't seem particularly likely to me at this point. It seems like Kyle Allen is a better player than those players. And I certainly think they'd be unlikely to make the team ahead of him.
Alan, I don't know how I do it. On Thursday's episode of Steelers Afternoon Drive, I mentioned, because Josh Dobbs had signed with San Fran, and someone had asked about like free agent options that were still out there, and I said Kyle Allen. So,
yeah,
I'm just going to throw it out.
Now I will say that this now almost assures that when we predicted our 4 Steelers quarterbacks, that we're both going at least 0 for the first 3.
Yeah, you're right.
Who was your 4th?
You're right.
Do you remember?
Trace McSorley.
Okay, I mean, and I had Felipe Franks. We've still got one bullet left, but we're not looking real good at this point.
No. Let me ask you something about that just popped in my mind in terms of naming a starting quarterback now. Any bearing potentially on like whether it's a free agent wide receiver or a wide receiver that you would be bringing in for a trade that you would have to extend? Like they want some assurance of who the quarterback is going to be as opposed to a competition. Like, is that also maybe a part of this equation at all?
I don't think so, because I think they understand it's going to be a competition. I mean, those two guys are going to go into training camp and battle. And, Mike Tomlin said, like, Justin Fields is going to get a chance to be the starting quarterback. Like, this is going to be a competition still, just despite the fact that one guy is starting with the number 1 spot and the other guy isn't. And so I'm curious to see how they're going to manage that, like in terms of reps. Is Fields going to get reps with the 1s at all in OTAs? Is it just going to be with the 2s? Will he get reps with the 1s in training camp? Will he get to play against number 1 defenses in the preseason? I mean, that'll really determine how serious they are about him getting a chance and this being a real competition. But I mean, I think for now what they're saying is that this is going to be a real competition, and they're probably not going to promise anybody anything in terms of playing time for the year, whether that's the guys on the team or somebody they would be looking to bring in. So, no, I don't think it really matters for wide receivers that would be on the market. Maybe you would want, like, if they were trying to sign, I don't know, Darnell Mooney. I mean, he already signed, so, like, whatever. Like, maybe he would want some kind of assurance that Fields would be able to get a chance to win the job, I guess. But hey, maybe Chase Claypool. He's a free agent, right? I mean, they could bring him in. Lots of experience with the backup there.
Yeah, and maybe some redundancy with George Pickens, but the name that came to mind for me in terms of a reunion was Cortland Sutton with Russell Wilson. But like, I don't know.
There you go.
Again, like,
well, that would be a trade anyway. So like the players.
I don't know what his contract's like, so I don't know if they would even be.
Do you want to transition to wide receiver? The Steelers made another move there, signing Quez Watkins from the Philadelphia Eagles, obviously, and Andy Weidl tie. He was drafted when Weidl was Howie Roseman's right-hand man there in Philly. Speed to burn, man. Ran a 4.3 at the combine coming out of Southern Miss. Has had a lot of experience. Been a 3 or 4 year regular for the Eagles as kind of their number 3 receiver, number 4 receiver, somewhere in that range. Plays mostly out of the slot. Hasn't done great statistically. Last year, he missed a bunch of games with an injury. But just on top of that, seems like a pretty limited ceiling in terms of what he can provide. But he's another slot option in addition to Calvin Austin, and feels to me like sort of the most likely replacement for Allen Robinson of the guys they've got on the roster. I think he's a guy that he could pretty well fill that role.
Okay. See, I was kind of seeing, I wanted to get your thought on this, is because I was kind of viewing Van Jefferson, because of his ability as a blocker, as an Allen Robinson replacement, and Quez Watkins maybe pushing Calvin Austin. Like, I thought maybe that was going to be a battle, not even a guarantee that they would both make the roster.
Yeah, so, I mean, Jefferson's been more of an outside guy than a slot guy. And so, I mean, not to say he couldn't do it, but I think he would be more of an option as like Allen Robinson had 2 roles, right? Where he was the slot receiver. He was also the third outside receiver last year. Behind, like when Deontay Johnson got hurt, he was the backup outside receiver. So I see Van Jefferson filling more of that role than a role as like a every down slot guy. That's not really anything he's ever been.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the need to add 2 receivers still, even after Van Jefferson. Is that no longer where you're at? Like, are we just talking maybe Tyler Boyd, or if not, they could just go to the draft and add one?
I feel like this is probably like they signed Quez Watkins instead of Tyler Boyd. I think that's
okay.
That's the way I look at this. I mean, he has not been as productive, but in terms of like role, like that's the role. Like that's what you're getting, a slot guy, who's like more experienced and more likely to be a better option this year than Calvin Austin.
Okay, so I mean, like, personal opinion on this, what is your thought on that then? Like, bit underwhelming? Like, did you think that they would go a little bit higher than this? Of course, like, they can't just wait around on Tyler Boyd forever. But, if this was their secondary option, like, were you surprised that this is the route they went?
No. I think most of the fan base has been aiming too high for wide receiver anyway. This is not an offense that is just going to throw the ball very much. Like, you look at Atlanta's numbers from last year, and like, yes, they didn't have great quarterback play, but they didn't even try to throw the ball that much. Like, they were like 14th in yards per attempt. They're actually kind of reasonably good at throwing the ball when they threw the ball. They just did not want to throw the ball. Like, they don't, like, that's not what this offense is. And their usage of their secondary and tertiary wide receivers is just very minimal. Like, there were some years in Tennessee where he did split things up when he had Corey Davis and he had A.J. Brown, where they ended up with 2 guys almost getting 1,000 yards each. But then those years, the third wide receiver did nothing. Last year in Atlanta, even the second wide receiver, the second wide receiver in Atlanta had fewer targets than both tight ends and both running backs. Like, so, And we've talked a lot about how I think they're going to want to use Darnell Washington because of his blocking ability.
Yeah.
I think we could see Pat Freiermuth end up taking a lot of like what has been that sort of third receiver role. I think Jaylen Warren is going to be on the field with Najee Harris a bunch, and that's going to take some of what has been a third receiver role. So I don't think you're talking about 3 starting wide receivers the way we have for the Steelers for a number of years now. I think it's more like the older days where you had a tight end and a fullback. Well, now maybe it's not a fullback, but maybe you have a second tight end, maybe a second running back that's taking up a good amount of those reps. And so I just don't see – I don't see them wanting to spend a lot of money on a third receiver. And look, I think they're going to draft another one highly to go with George Pickens. I don't think they're going to want to spend money on a third receiver. And I don't think guys that are third receiver options are going to want to come to Pittsburgh to get the 21 targets that Van Jefferson had in Atlanta last year. Like, it's not worth it to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talked about the slot specifically. If that is where Quez is going to line up, 34 targets in total to their slot receivers last year in Atlanta under Arthur Smith. So yeah, I mean it's just not. It hasn't been a productive position for them. But I was going to ask you. You kind of went to my next question because you were talking about still the thought process that they could draft a receiver and draft one highly. It was where I was going to go because they still Tomlin talked about addressing a center and addressing a receiver still needing to be done. Of course, like they're not. I don't know if did they confirm themselves about the Quez Watkins thing yet?
Yes.
Or was that just okay? Yes. All right. So I didn't know if that was kind of maybe being floated out there as part of that. But the move at center, also like Omar didn't roll out, and why would he? Like a potential trade or anything like that. Also said like the draft is obviously an option as well as free agency. So really all avenues there. But like the thought entered my mind, like how many teams are trading a starting quality center? Like they're just that doesn't happen. Like and same can be said about tackle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are a couple. Nick Faribault and I just spent like 15 minutes going through some depth charts trying to find some answers. The Jaguars signed Mitch Morse as a free agent, and Luke Fortner has been their center the last 2 years. Still got 2 years left on his rookie deal. He'll be pretty cheap. So like maybe that's an option. There are a couple of guys like that out there. There are not a ton of them, but there are a couple. Liam Eichenberg is a guy that they signed Aaron Brewer, right? And so he's a guy that's probably going to be out of a starting job. And so there's a couple of those guys. And then we talked about before about Clegg, and that's where Biadasz went, right? Washington. And so he's a free agent, but I think there's still a couple of those guys out there. And we talked a lot about Brian Allen. I don't know that any of those guys would preclude them from drafting a center highly. I think they're a bunch of stopgap types. They're a bunch of, they're just a bunch of Mason Coles. Again, like it's still so bizarre to me why they released Mason Cole when they did. It didn't even save them that much cap space. And if we would be talking about this offseason much differently if he was still on the roster, don't you think? Like, I don't know. It just has put an urgency to the center position that I don't know needed to exist.
I think we'd be talking about it similarly to tackle, where it's like, would we like to upgrade there? Sure. Right. But like, if it doesn't happen, you have a guy that could start.
Was Mason Cole worse than Dan Moore last year? Like, yeah, but left tackle's a lot more important than center. So like, if they were both still on the roster and both still on the roster at reasonable salary cap hits, I don't know that there would be a big difference between what the team needed at center and what the team needed at tackle right now.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. That's not to say like I wanted Mason Cole to be the starter in 2024 or feel like Dan Moore should be the starter in 2024. It's, again, more about feeling like there's some type of safety net there at the position, a guy that could start. Like Mason Cole, don't get me wrong, the pass protection was very ugly as well in 2023. But how many of the issues were more so just about snapping? And like that's just so weird. Like, is that going to happen at a second straight season?
No, and it was he was fine in 2022, and also now you have an offense that figures to go under center a whole lot more, which would mitigate a whole bunch of those options, a whole bunch of the issues. So, I mean, I think they tried to do it to like help him out and let him find another role, but obviously that didn't work. You have to really wonder if bringing him back at this point is something that's on the table. Because they've got to do something before the draft, and really, I think that's kind of what the theme of today's three moves was that just kind of guys where like slot receiver, defensive tackle, and third string quarterback were all sort of things I would have put on their draft card as like things they kind of needed to get. Needed another rotational defensive tackle when they lost Armon Watts. Obviously not going to go into the year with only two quarterbacks, and probably not going to go into the year with just Calvin Austin as options as a slot receiver, right? Well, now they have those three guys. Now, are those three guys going to stop them from drafting Braden Fiske, Mikey Samerstill, or Roman Wilson and Zach Frazier? No, not even one little bit. But if the draft doesn't go the way they want it to, now they're protected at those positions. They have some guys to fall back on. But they don't have that at center. And they really still don't have that at outside receiver, too. I mean, they need another outside receiver. They need a slot corner. I think the difference between center and those positions are the draft is extremely deep at wide receiver and corner, where like it's just impossible to come up with a circumstance where you would get to a point in the draft where you're like, we just couldn't find a wide receiver. 7 picks went by, and none of them was there a guy on the board that we liked at that spot. Like, it's implausible. Yeah. And the same thing with cornerback. Also, I mean, Mike Tomlin talked about the door being open to a Patrick Peterson return. He wasn't specifically asked about Shandon Sullivan, but the fact that their own internal options are just sitting there a phone call away certainly gives them a lot more wiggle room at corner, where if they don't go get a slot guy, they can just call up Pat Peter, call up Shandon Sullivan and say, hey, why don't you come back? And so I think that helps there. It seems like what Mike T said about Pat Pete was that if he comes back, it's going to be after the draft, that they're going to let things play out and see what they get and then make a decision about whether they want him back. I think you could probably put other guys like Shannon Sullivan, Eric Rowe in that mix as well, where, hey, if they draft guys at that position and draft them highly, they're probably not going to go back to one of those returning veterans. But if it doesn't work out, or maybe they draft somebody, let's say, that has a significant injury history or might not be ready for the start of the season, like that could change things. But it's just going to depend on how the draft goes and what guys they end up with.
And like, that makes sense to me. That process fully makes sense to me. Unlike what we're talking about with center. Like, I can fully get on board with the idea of like waiting it out to see if one of those guys makes sense to bring back into the fold. I can't, I'm not in lockstep with whatever they're doing at center here. I don't know. I mean, I'll let it play out, but it's very curious.
Yeah, I totally agree. Where did we miss?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would say we've been talking a lot about the offensive line. The Broderick Jones stuff has been highly talked about by the fan base, and it was addressed today. Right tackle, left tackle. Does he have to transition to left tackle at some point to justify a trade up, or is that considered his quote unquote natural position? Should he not play on the right side? Any more of a sense from conversations with Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan today when we could see that? Because they made it seem like it's a matter of when, not if, at left tackle. And, I don't know if that's going to be the case in 2024.
Yeah, I kind of got the sense from talking to Mike Tomlin yesterday that it is not going to happen this year unless they find some kind of upgrade at right tackle. That, they're not willing to, like, if it's Dan Moore and Broderick Jones again, it's going to be Dan Moore at left tackle and Broderick Jones at right tackle. Now, if they bring someone in the draft that they feel like can unseat Dan Moore, they're going to try to do that, I think. And if they feel like they're able to use their first round pick on a tackle and aren't so locked in at center the way they appear to be, or wide receiver, then that maybe becomes pretty easy to manage, right? If you go get J.C. Latham from Alabama, I think it's a slam dunk. You move Broderick Jones to the left side, play Latham at right tackle, and it's done. Now, if you get a guy like Tyler Guyton, I'm not even sure which side he'll end up being better on. He could be more of a left tackle. He's a better pass protector than he is a run blocker. He's certainly a project that isn't going to start day one anyway. Marius Mims, I think he's a guy you got to get into camp and see, just because the lack of tape, only 8 college games. Like, the tape is great, but how much stock can you put in him replicating that? Again, would be another guy I think would probably not start day one. So the number of guys that are going to move Dan Moore off of his job starting September 8th or whatever, September 9th, are pretty minimal. I mean, they exist, but there aren't too many of them out there. So then the real big question, I guess, is if it's a situation like last year where you draft somebody, whether that's in the first round or the second round, you expect those guys to become starters sooner rather than later. But would you make that move mid-season if it involves moving 2 players? Like if let's say the draft pick is Patrick Paul, right, from Houston in the second round. He's clearly a right tackle, big, huge right tackle. Kind of reminds me of Max Starks a little bit. If they draft him and he's not going to start day one, will they still leave Broderick at right tackle and Moore at left tackle? And then would they be willing to make the double switch, move Broderick to left tackle mid-season to get a Patrick Paul into the fold? Or would that simply at that point be a redshirt year for that guy, and you're looking at going into 2025 when Dan Moore's contract is expired and then making the move? I think they have a lot of options there, and I think it really depends on the player and not just like the this is probably a question that they're not going to be able to answer for us on April 29th either. Like, I think this is a question that is probably going to take some time to see who they get, and not only who they get, but how they look in this offense during OTAs and minicamp before they really make that decision, because I think it's a pretty tough one. I do think eventually we are going to see Broderick Jones as the Steelers left tackle, except I will say this, like, if they happen to get their hands on a guy, Tyler Guyton is really the only one that I think in this area this really applies to, but mostly because I think most of the rest of the guys that they could draft at 20 or 51 would be right tackles. But like, if they get a guy who profiles to be a better left tackle than a right tackle, I don't think it hurts Broderick Jones at all to play right tackle. I think he can be a very good right tackle. I think guys with his skill set frequently end up being right tackles. Like, the problem is not Broderick Jones playing right tackle. The problem is that the Steelers left tackle is not very good. Like, that's the problem. If they had, some all-pro at left tackle, no one would care about Broderick Jones playing right tackle, despite the fact that he played left tackle in college and was drafted highly. Like, it just doesn't matter.
1, 2, 3. Check.
Yeah, you mentioned Tyler Guyton. I'll be honest, even like Amarius Mims, like I mean, this is just my personal opinion of him. I thought his pass pro is further advanced from Broderick, even though he's only played 8 games. I just think it looks much more polished and he's a lot cleaner. And I think Broderick is the better run defender. So I question there if, obviously not right away, but like long term, if that would be a situation, Mims on the left side, Broderick on the right side.
I mean, it's possible. It's certainly possible. I don't know. Yeah, it's like I think the idea that Broderick Jones is somehow being wasted or somehow being harmed by playing on the right side has been way overblown. I don't think that's a thing. I think he could very well end up being a right tackle in the NFL. And lots and lots and lots of NFL right tackles started out their careers as left tackles in college. In fact, it's like baseball players. Every baseball player that played shortstop for their little league team and for and for their college team, right? Because they were the best player. Well, every offensive lineman played left tackle in high school. Every offensive lineman in the NFL that went to a small college or went to a place where there's not a lot of depth played left tackle and then made the move over. So I think that's really it's overblown. I'm sure it gets some attention because of what happened with Kevin Dotson and sort of that the Steelers like somehow screwed him up or wasted him, which, I mean, I guess there's some credence to that. There are certainly some guys that are far better at one spot than another, far more suited to one spot than another. I've just never got the sense that Broderick Jones is that guy.
The last thing I want to make sure that we hit on, because we've touched on most of these topics today, but Mike Sullivan's new role, because, kind of touching on, we didn't know that he was going to stay with the organization, especially once they hired Tom Arth as the new quarterbacks coach, but he was, and kind of the way that it was mapped out to everybody in terms of explaining his role, sure just sounds like he's a pass game coordinator. When he talked about kind of like his wide encompassing experience and his work with the wide receivers as well. What was your takeaway from the way that his role was described? And is that basically what he's going to be for this team?
Sure seems like it. And I think the way that he performed as the interim offensive coordinator down the stretch should give some credence to him being good at that job. I guess we'll see. It's hard because like when he was offensive coordinator, it's not like his passing offenses were some sort of like dynamic success. I mean, it was just okay. And he had Eli Manning for half of that time. So, got at least, decent quarterback play. But I just think it's helpful to have a little bit of continuity on the offensive staff in terms of knowledge of the players. I mean, obviously the quarterbacks are all different, but he's a guy that's worked with George Pickens and probably the only guy that's really worked with George Pickens since they had turnover at wide receivers coach as well.
Right.
That could be helpful. And I think there's going to be a little bit of trickle down of responsibilities. Mike Tomlin talked about this as well. Having Arthur Smith, who was a former head coach on the staff, I think he's probably going to lean on him a lot more for a lot more things than he did Matt Canada. In terms of like the day-to-day responsibilities of running practice and making decisions. Mike Tomlin's been pretty heavily involved with the offense the last couple of years. It's not really his specialty. It's probably not what he would prefer to do. I think there's something to that. And so whether or not when you have a guy like Arthur Smith, doing that role, I think having somebody else to be that sort of sub coordinator, if he's going to be pulled away to do some different things, becomes pretty useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good stuff, Alan. Like I said, I think we covered most of the things that were talked about today. If we missed anything, we can obviously bring it up tomorrow, and we'll see what tomorrow brings us news-wise as well. But until then, other than the owners' meetings, Alan, tell the people where they can find you.
Saunders _ PGH on Twitter, PGH Steelers Now, SteelersNow.com, like 1,000 stories.
Yep,
Nick
1,001.
Fairbaugh has. He texted me the like Popeye's worker with her hands on her knees, like tired meme, and he deserves it because he's been busting his butt. So all kinds of stuff up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell here. Leave us a 5-star review if you're listening somewhere else, Apple, Spotify, wherever that might be. Hit us in the comments with any thoughts, questions, comments, of course. I'm Zachary Smith, PGH, for Alan Saunders, and myself. Thanks for jumping in, taking another ride with us on the Steelers Afternoon Drive.